besides being a New Jersey boy who went to Columbia, became a superstar in the music world as a music supervisor, besides being a champ in bodybuilding, is that correct?
Powerlifting.
Powerlifting, and knowing more trivia, only second to Ken Jennings, which I would argue is not actually the case. My dear friend Buzzy Cohen. So welcome, Buzzy.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Looking forward to it.
What was your journey like to becoming a Jeopardy champion and to becoming, this well-known Jewish expertise and for our world?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of have a past similar to a lot of people where I grew up loving the show. I grew up loving trivia. My parents used to give me those Brain Quest cards in the back of the car, before we could hand kids the iPad. That was kind of my road trip go-to. My grandfather bought me the World Book Encyclopedia, and I was not a good sleeper as a kid. And so my mom used to talk about coming in and there'd be the stack of encyclopedias that I'd been flipping through, sort of the way I do now I still do it with Wikipedia, but it's less of a stack, right? I just have a bunch of tabs open. And then I did some Quiz Bowl in high school. Quiz Bowl is a team-based trivia game that is very common for high school and colleges. And I got to college, I didn't do Quiz Bowl because they were too serious. I liked having fun, and I was kind of irreverent. One tournament, my teammates and I looked at the rules, and you have to have a name for them to call you, but it doesn't say it has to be your name. So we came up with foursomes, because it's always a team of four. And we gave ourselves these four, it was like Leonardo, Donatello, Michelangelo, Raphael, and they had to call us that. That was the rule. The rule was you had to call anyway. You get the idea. So I liked having fun.
Weren't you one of the first? I think you were the one that started on Jeopardy, writing in the box question at the end a message to Alex or to the world. Or to your wife.
People had done some things like that, but I think I definitely took it to a different level by making it sort of a joke with Alex. Alex Jacob, who was on my team for All Stars, he wrote "What is Aleve?" because Aleve used to be the sponsor of the of the show. And so people had done things like that, but I was the first one to kind of make it with the kind of SNL Sean Connery, ribbing Trebek thing. Anyway, long story short, a few years ago, I was watching Jeopardy again. I had a long stretch of time where I wasn't watching the show because I didn't have cable, but I got bunny ears, and I was watching the show again, and they advertised that you could, take the test on your computer. And I took it on a whim. I got called in for an in-person audition months later. I did that, and then I got called to tape the show. I was actually an alternate first because they always have an extra person who lives in Southern California, so they're not flying you out to be an extra person, but they have an extra person on set in case, God forbid, something happens where somebody can't compete. Either, I've heard about people getting sick that day, or they find out that there's a conflict, like their brother works at Sony Pictures and turns out they can't compete. So they always have an extra person. So I was actually on set for one whole tape day before I ended up being on the show. And I will say, since this is AJU, I do pretty good on the Bible and Old Testament questions, but I did in my Tournament of Champions, there was a very, very hard biblical widows category, and I missed the daily double. I had narrowed it down to two women, and I just flipped the coin and chose the wrong one.
I think I texted you after that, and I was like, that's not even fair. That's not even a rabbi question. It was so fair. I think I texted you that. Yeah. So then you went on 2 days straight. You played 5 games a day and won all 10 of them.
No, I won 9. I lost the 10th one.
Right. What was that like? I mean, that cannot be easy.
It's exhausting. It's really hard. And I think that is actually one of the biggest hurdles for people going on long streaks. I mean, obviously there's Ken Jennings' streak. And, recently James Holzhauer. But I think the hardest thing for people is, they usually tape 2 or 3 days a week. So I taped on a Monday, I taped 5 shows. And even though that week aired with a break because they had tournaments, I came back the next day and taped another 5 days. And it's really, really intense. the experience feels very compressed and very stressful. It tapes basically in real time, so they tape a show in about 30 minutes. It's really like they've got it down. There's not a lot of, you know, oh, let's edit this together. They really play it like they play it down. During the commercial break time, Alex, you know, does audio pickups if he has to. They'll stop tape if there's a problem, but basically it runs through. So it is a very high paced day, fast paced day. You're on your feet, which is already for most of us something that we're not used to, right? We're used to kind of sitting. So, and then of course that night I just won $100,000. I knew I was going back. And not only that, I'm thinking about the things that I missed and like the close calls I had and all that stuff. So it's very hard to sleep. There's a lot of excitement and adrenaline, and then you go and do it all again. So it's, I think, you know, they say a lot of people lose on Thursdays because that's right after the lunch break, right? So I made it through that, but I was definitely, I don't think people at home noticed, but when I watch back the first run of games, I can see the exhaustion on my face.
Right. It's almost not just a test of your mind, but a test of your will and your stamina and your
Absolutely.
emotional
And your ability to stay focused. I mean, for people who have, you know, remember final exams in high school or college, or sitting for the bar, you know, or any kind of multi-day or long testing thing, it's really hard to keep your focus and keep yourself sharp. And, you know, people make mistakes. People get, you know, if they're having a hard time, they start trying to buzz in just to get in when they don't even know the answer. You see a lot of people make those kinds of fatigue related errors. And also just the people that every time you win a game, you've got two fresh opponents coming in to, you know, go after you. By Friday, they've watched you play 4 games from the audience. So they probably feel like they, you know, kind of know your style or know your weaknesses, and they're, you know, they're probably out for blood, like especially if there's someone who's like me who had gone on a long streak. The 2 women that I faced on the last day, they wanted to take me down. They were like, and I get it, like I wanted to win every game and they really wanted to win. And yeah, so I went out, you know, holding my head high. I got Final Jeopardy right. I just hadn't gotten enough during the game.
I was going to say, a lot of people, like, quote, fell in love with you, like the word, because you weren't the typical player, right? You're very affable, and I can attest to this. You're very real. Sometimes, you know, some of the players are not as lackluster, or maybe they're not in the public eye. And you seem to have such a rapport with Alex. Can you talk a little bit about your comfort level and how it was suddenly being thrust on TV and then?
Yeah. You know, I have a background as a musician, and I was used to being on stage and performing. I work in advertising, and I've spent time on sets and stuff like that. So a lot of the things that kind of like fluster people, understandably, did not fluster me. And it's interesting that, you know, Austin Rogers, my friend who was in the Tournament of Champions with me, also has a background as a musician. And both of us have had in our own ways, a lot of comfort on stage and felt we could easily be ourselves. And Alex Trebek has commented that he finds that the types of people that do well are teachers and lawyers, because they're used to speaking in front of people in, you know, potentially stressful situations and thinking on their feet, right? And that's something that, you know, we don't, in a lot of our daily lives, we don't have to do. But I think, you know, I would say musicians and people, you know, salespeople are probably really good at this as well. But I think there's a reason you see a lot of lawyers do well on the show. You know, it's a similar to, you know, arguing a case in court.
Well, and you have to tap into a lot of different parts of yourself. And I think that's why you were so, and continue to be very inspiring for people, because you have this showmanship, but you also have this tremendous intellect combined with this warmth. Do you think that had to do with your Jewish upbringing or how you were raised? I want to weave a little bit.
Yeah.
Was your curiosity for learning?
Well, I think, you know, there are those two sides of our culture, right? There's sort of the academic, like people of the book side, right? And then there's sort of the vaudeville performer, you know, showbiz side. And I certainly had both of that. Like when I was a kid, the two things I wanted to be when I grew up were I wanted to be a biologist, or this is like when I was like 3 or 4, right? I wanted to be a herpetologist.
Oh,
Um,
what?
a herpetologist,
I
which
have
is
no idea
somebody
what
who
that is.
studies reptiles and amphibians.
Oh,
I wanted to either be that or this thing that I invented, which was like an entertainer. This was the word I used. So I liked, I was a musician and I liked telling jokes. And so I had this idea that of doing those two things. And of course, on Jeopardy, I got the opportunity to do both. And I found that like the more fun I was having, the better I did, because I was sort of more relaxed. It was sort of this self-fulfilling thing where I would get stuff right. I was having fun. I could be more myself. That in turn kind of allowed me to just be more relaxed. And I think people tend to perform better when they're
well, it's such a good
relaxed.
lesson for life, right? If you can lean into being your authentic self, it makes everything just easier, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think I'm lucky that my authentic self is, likes to have fun and is somewhat affable and, you know, kind of.
And there was a lot of talk that you were quite close to Alex, um, or that you had a nice relationship. Can
Yeah,
you talk a little bit about that?
yeah, we did have a nice relationship. I think, though, to be honest, the first time I was on the show, he didn't quite know what to make of me. I think he's not. Most of the contestants are certainly more in the kind of a little more bookish, a little less wanting to kind of like play with the show, whether it's the Final Jeopardy thing or doing little things during the intro. And between the first time I was on and the Tournament of Champions, when I came back, I think he kind of realized the effect that our relationship had. I mean, he was totally on board with the Final Jeopardy, kind of having fun. And when I would do the intros, he would kind of do the thing that I had done. So he was certainly having fun with it. I think he had a great sense of humor and a much goofier personality than the sort of Alex Trebek persona of the sort of scolding teacher. But I think it allowed him to show more of that. And then, Austin Rogers was so off the wall that I kind of looked very staid. By the time I got back for the Tournament of Champions, he was like all in on it. And I think it was easier for him to get on board. And then since then, when I've had the chance to go back either to compete for something like All Stars or just go to a taping, occasionally I'll, if I have a friend in town, I'll go to, call up a producer and see if I can get a seat. And, he's always excited to see me. I went back recently, or not that recently, but after the Tournament of Champions for Hanukkah that year, my wife made me a wrestling belt that said like Jeopardy champion, because we thought it was funny that you win the Tournament of Champions. Of course you get the check. That's the best prize you could get, but there's like no trophy or anything. So she went to a trophy shop planning to make me a trophy, and then saw that there was a wrestling boxing style belt and had one of those made. And I brought it to set just to show, the crew who I'd gotten to know. And he heard about it and was like, okay, here's what we were going to do. And had me do this thing where he introed me as very, humble and soft-spoken and mild-mannered. And then I, stood up and showed the belt. And that was all him. He loved getting an opportunity to kind of play. And he came up not just as a CBC broadcaster, but also he did a lot of really fun game shows, that were less intellectually focused than Jeopardy. And I think he really leaned into the intellectual side and enjoyed it. But I think he also liked being able to have a little fun. And so I think part of our connection was that I allowed him to do that more. And I think he really appreciated that.
Yeah, you could tell. So I can imagine that his diagnosis and the announcement was incredibly difficult for you. And then you wrote about how it gave you the courage to share about your own struggles with mental health. So tell us a little bit about why you wrote the article about your mental health and about his loss and how that affected you.
Yeah, I in interviews around the time of the first time my shows aired, I would talk about the depression, but of course people wanted to talk about a ton of stuff, and that was just a small part of it. But I thought it was important kind of from the beginning to make sure that part doesn't get left out of my story, because it is part of who I am. part of what got me, what I was dealing with going into my taping, and also like something that's I'm continuing, I still deal with, and that Jeopardy was a piece of helping me, but just one piece, helping me kind of deal with and find ways to overcome. Um, I thought it was really brave of Alex Trebek. I think a lot of the times when we have public figures who are fighting tough illnesses or challenges, there's a like kind of this brave face thing, like, oh yes, every day I'm fighting. And he said that, but he also said there were days where I was just like, there's no way out of this darkness. And I think that I was really touched that he did that. And so I wanted to highlight that piece because I know that I knew there were going to be a lot of things written about how bravely, and the fact that, he was taping shows 10 days before he ended up passing because he just wanted to keep going, and he loved, he loved the show, he loved taping. And I think he survived a lot longer than this sort of diagnosis usually gives you. And I think having the show was part of that. I wanted to make sure that people could find more of the story that they needed than just like, oh, he was so brave and kept going. Because when you're dealing with depression, you don't want to keep going. It's really hard to keep going. You don't want to feel better. And I kind of wanted people to know that even folks like Alex, who seems totally like unflappable when he's on camera, or me, who was like joking and smiling, that doesn't mean that we're not struggling with things and that we're not feeling like, at times like we don't want to be in this world anymore, or whatever that, however that manifests. Because I think it's, people have this vision, right, of a depressed person, can't get out of bed or totally non-functioning. And I think a lot of us are functioning or high functioning, but that doesn't mean that we're not struggling. And I think the more that folks hear about it, the easier it is to find the resources that they need. I think that is its own challenge with, whether it's therapy or psychiatry with medication or whatever it is. I think, there's a whole slew of other challenges for people once they want help being able to get it. But I think there's also a huge internal hurdle for being like, okay, I'm going to go get help, or I'm going to talk to somebody, or I'm going to, just. So I think there's a huge stigma around it. I think we like to unconsciously remove some of that darkness from the narrative because it makes us really uncomfortable. It's much more heroic if Alex Trebek, in a way, like just faced it every day, and then, but he wanted to stop. He didn't want it to keep going. He was, and likewise, like, I had my own challenges. So I'm kind of rambling, but
no, I just think I was listening to you because I think one of the things that's so inspiring about Alex is his humanity.
yeah,
And he's not a celebrity because he's been in and out of rehab and done a million things. It's just his vulnerability and how inspiring that is. And I think it's not surprising that you guys shared an affinity towards each other because you have that same vulnerability. And I think you're using this platform as you continue to go on. I think to be able to use that platform and shine a light on mental health, that it doesn't always look like someone who can't get out of bed,
yeah,
but that mental health is real, even for the most perky, happiest people you see in the world, and to
yeah.
get conscious.
And even people who are like, oh, you've got this, you had this. Even after I was on Jeopardy, it took me a long time. I was still struggling. Obviously I got a big lift, in the tape day and afterwards, but it's not a straight line, and people are like, oh, but you had this great success, and, you've got this family and stuff like that. And it's just like, it's not, I mean, I think there's a misconception, right, that you're depressed about something. It's an objective thing. And I think that's sad. You can be sad about objective things, but depression is subjective, right? It's the subject so it's like, whatever it is, it's the depression is kind of cast out on the world. So I think that, a lot of the ways that people try to reason with people who are depressed are not helpful. And I kind of just want people to remember that, like, oh, you've got this cool, great job, and you had this amazing thing on the show. It's like, yeah, but you can still be depressed. You can be Alex Trebek
Right.
and getting the best treatment that the world has to offer for this illness and still feel like, what am I doing here? Like,
and still be a victim of pancreatic cancer, which more often than not kills people, right? Pancreatic cancer doesn't care if you're Alex Trebek or who you are, right? And I think that's shining a light on that. There's a lot of questions coming in, and I want to make sure we get to them all.
Yeah, let's do it.
So let's just start off. What'd you do with the money?
Most of it is a college fund for my daughter, to be honest. My daughter
that was
now.
Good. That was great. And what was the hard biblical question that you were asked?
It was, I gotta remember it, but it was about,
I remember
it was about a woman. It was the woman who has a book named after her, and it named who she was the widow of.
It was Ruth. It was Moabite.
It was Ruth. Yeah.
It was Ruth. Who is Ruth? I remember thinking.
Yeah, and I remember narrowing it down to Ruth and Esther, and of course, like I knew that wasn't. I knew like that's not part of like Esther's story, but I thought, maybe there was something that I forgot where she had been married and was a widow or whatever. I know Judith is a widow as well. Anyway, you just get up there and you kind of freeze. Like, if without the lights and stuff, I could have gotten to Ruth, but I was like, I've narrowed it down to Ruth and Esther. I'm going to roll the dice here.
I remember you saying that, and I'm like, roll right, So
that happens a lot, like there was a question that I think I narrowed down once for like Hittites and Assyrians, and I chose Assyrians and it was Hittites. Like if you can get it to a 50-50, depending on the dollar value, sometimes it's worth taking a risk.
Right. And there's different styles of play. I mean, Alex Jacobs introduced us to a whole different style of play with starting with the big numbers and just hitting that buzzer, whether he knew it or not. Right. I mean,
having like studied with him for All Stars, I mean, he knows most of this stuff, but his big thing was just like making it much more, and James plays similarly, right? Where it's like, it's all just points. It's all points until you win. So he's like, the potential upside of betting it all on a daily double is so high that unless it's a subject or a category that you're not, has proven to be very difficult or that you're not comfortable, make the big bets, bet it all. There's usually time to make it up, right? And you have more information usually on a daily double than on a Final Jeopardy question, right? So relative difficulty based on where it is on the board. Maybe you've gotten a couple other questions in that category, so you kind of know the type of things they're asking. Final Jeopardy, you have very little information, and so a lot of times people bet small on daily doubles, and then they end up having to bet really big on Final Jeopardy, and you don't really know what that Final Jeopardy clue is even talking about. Like you have a subject, but American icons, that could be anything. Like magazines could be anything. That was a recent Final Jeopardy, because it could be like, this magazine put this person on the cover, blah 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 blah. Exactly like this question. So
that was the Oprah one.
Who is the Oprah one? Yeah.
I became like I was a fan, and then I became an obsessed fan when you were on, and now I'm just back to being a fan.
So Alex, that I think that was a good insight, that a lot of people have done well, but it's hard. It's hard in the moment to make those big bets. I trained myself to get better at that going into my Tournament of Champions, and in All Stars even more so. So there's all kinds of things that you learn when you're on the show that, if you're like me and you're lucky enough to go back, hopefully you improve, which I think I did.
Right. Absolutely. So talk to us about training and preparation, because you're not running 50 miles in order to get the medal, but you are training and preparing.
Yeah. So what I realized was that, watching Jeopardy at 7 o'clock or 7:30, or if you're in Chicago, 4 or whenever it airs there, it airs really early in Chicago. Watching that every night, sitting on the couch is a far cry from appearing on the show, where, you're at the studio at 7 a.m., You start tape around 9:30, 10, and you're taping, as we said, 5 shows a day on your feet against 2 other people who are really good, usually in clothes that are maybe a little nicer than you're used to wearing, maybe shoes that you don't wear all the time. I realized how ill prepared I was for the actual experience of being on the show. And so what I did was start to figure out ways of better preparing myself, which I continued to work on each time I was invited back. But studying a lot of material. There are all kinds of archives. Now you can watch Jeopardy shows on Netflix and get a lot more content. I studied at the times of day that the show taped because I wanted my brain chemistry to be as similar as possible to what it was going to be when I was on the show. Anyone who works at an office or is just a human being knows your brain is maybe sharper or duller at 10, at 3, at 7 p.m. It's all different, right? And we tend to kind of like build our day around that, right? Like we like to do certain types of tasks at certain times. All of that is us kind of coping with these changing internal chemical environment of our brain. And so what I did was I built my training around that so that I knew that I could, I was trying to prepare as much as possible for what I was actually going to have to do. I did a lot of studying standing up. I know that sounds silly, but I did. I also went to the gym. I actually went to the gym, and not only was I physically training because, to be for health and all that stuff, but I went to the gym because I was trying to figure out how to recreate the stress of being on the show, faced with the question and having to come up with it with the lights, 2 other contestants, studio audience, Alex Trebek, the whole thing. And what I realized was like hanging from a chin-up bar or holding a plank and having my mind go completely blank as I was sort of just like in survival mode of not letting go was really as close as I could find on a regular basis safely to recreate the cortisol, the adrenaline, all that stuff. And so I would bring my flashcards or other study materials to the gym, and I had a trainer, and I would hang from the chin-up bar and he would quiz me on stuff. And I think that really helped me figure out ways. I already knew the material, right? Like I had to already know the material. I wasn't learning things while I was hanging from the chin-up bar, but I was able to sort of like temper that knowledge by like, okay, can I get better at accessing it when everything in my body wants to kind of shut down and go blank? And I still had moments where things went blank, but I also had moments where I was able to push through that, which I learned how to do through that kind of
when things did go blank and you did learn how to push through, what did you do? Because I think a lot of time people have to publicly speak or present and their mind goes blank and they don't know what to do in that moment.
Well, I think part of it was like I had sort of trained myself, not necessarily, I didn't have like any sort of mnemonic like thing, but I just trained myself to be used to that feeling of kind of like the excitement, the adrenaline, the stress, and still like keep going. And so it's sort of like I built the neural pathways kind of around those roadblocks more than having like a kind of like a tool or trick. I just built the stress into the training. So I think that's,
it mirrors your journey with depression. It's sort of like you found the neural pathways in order to just keep going even with the depression.
Yeah. And I think that's a big thing when people do prepare for things like a speech at a wedding or a public speaking thing. Like you do it comfortably at home. You're not, wearing a tie that maybe feels tight around your neck or shoes that are uncomfortable. I tell people when I talk to them about preparing for those kinds of things, like film yourself. The second a camera starts running, even if you're by yourself, you become more self-conscious. And that gives you a little bit of a taste of what that performance experience is going to be. And it's not about, the stress isn't going to go away, and I think anything that's worth doing, anything that is important to you, you're going to be stressed about, right? Because you want to do a good job if it's important to you. So it's not about making the stress go away. It's about inoculating yourself, to use a word that we're all having a lot of fun with these days, inoculating yourself to the stress so that it doesn't totally cripple you, right? It's like, okay, my body I'm used to that kind of internal environment, right? So it's about preparing for the external environment, things like the time of day, being on my feet, stuff like that. And then also the internal environment of fear and stress and excitement and all that stuff.
Well, and you're so humble. What you don't know is that you wrote a book on being prepared. You can download it on Audible. It's in your voice, correct?
Yeah, I got to write and read it, which was really a fun experience. And in addition to preparing for Jeopardy, as you mentioned, I trained for and ended up winning an amateur deadlifting competition. I was learning how to tap dance, which is, I'm not a trained dancer at all, so that was a big challenge for me. But I also interviewed some really interesting people. A guy I knew who actually was on Robert Mueller's team, who did all the depositions. Imagine, it's easy, no shade, but like it's easy when you're, the NPR person doing an interview and somebody really wants to talk to you. Imagine like, talking to someone like Roger Stone, who really doesn't want to talk to you. And I interviewed a glass blower who had a really interesting story. A competitive coffee brewer. So I tried to find people who had these kind of performance situations and saw how they prepared and what they did really well and what stuff was maybe didn't go so well. And I had, there's a whole chapter about, a part of my preparation that I really messed up in my All-Stars appearance. So it's all to say, like, it's really helpful for, I hope, anybody, like whatever you have to do.
Fast few questions.
Yes.
Do they interview the contestant and then build the categories around who's appearing on that show?
No, in fact, they're not allowed to. If any of you saw the movie Quiz Show, that's a federal offense to do stuff like that. So we don't get any information about categories, clues, anything. And in fact, the contestant team and the team that writes the clues and stuff like that are kind of separate, and we're kept separate from those other teams to make sure that there's standards and practices are followed, so there isn't another federal lawsuit against a game show.
And by the way, if you haven't seen Quiz Show, it's worth a watch. It's a great, if you like Jeopardy, you'll like Quiz Show, the movie.
And Jeopardy actually exists because of that Quiz Show scandal. They got in trouble for giving the answers to people. So Merv Griffin, I don't know if it was him or his wife, said, why don't you give them the answers? And then they have to come up with the questions. So that's why Jeopardy, the phrasing is such that the clue is a statement and then the response is in the form of a question, because they were kind of playing with that. Like, here's a quiz show where we give you the answers.
That's so interesting. That's like a real trivia. Like, I feel like that could be a Jeopardy question. Like, how has your Jeopardy experience changed your parenting skills?
Well, it helps to be famous for being right, especially when you've got young kids and they want to fight you about everything. So I just say, hey, did you see Daddy on TV? Was I right a lot? So I'm right about this.
Oh, that's a great strategy, I'm sure.
And it's also helpful because kids have a lot of questions, and knowing a lot of stuff makes it very easy to very quickly give them an answer.
And is your Jewish upbringing, how you were raised, similar to how you're parenting your children Jewishly?
Well, it's interesting. My wife grew up all over the place, but primarily on the West Coast. And certainly I noticed a difference between, like, her dad is a conservative rabbi. I grew up in a conservative synagogue. And I think there's certainly a difference between the East Coast Judaism and West Coast Judaism, at least the West Coast Judaism that I've experienced, which is, I think there's definitely more of a emphasis on the traditional kind of stuff on the East Coast that I see, and a more of an emphasis on kind of interpretive, trying to find meaning, more contemporary meaning. And I think that's changing, and I think there's more, but this is, I'm generalizing, right? There are very traditionalist synagogues here in California, right, and very interpretive ones in New York and New Jersey and wherever else. But so I think it's interesting because, like, my connection to a lot of the stuff is in those sort of traditional things, and my wife is looking for connection by, contemporary, finding the contemporary connection. So I think my kids are getting a very different Jewish upbringing than I got, but I also think that's good, because I think, it's easy when it's about the rote traditions to kind of not see the deeper value in some of the stuff.
And finally, because we're running out of time, we're already over time a little bit. What's next for you?
I'm, still talking to people occasionally about stuff. I'd love to go on another, quiz show. I think that would be really fun. And it seems like after the GOAT tournament, there's a real appetite for that. So yeah, and I'm, trying to maybe, find a way to stay, keep sharing that, like, it's important to know things and you can have fun knowing things. And that's kind of what I'm trying to be focused on these days.
So, Buzzy, our entire platform is meant to bring Jewish wisdom to individuals, communities, and the world. And it's really to shine a light on Jews and people that are bringing that to the world. And I think you being on Jeopardy, you using that platform to make awareness about mental health, you just being you, which is just a great dad and father, and all those things is such a tribute. And I'm so honored and privileged today that you showed up and that you're here with us. I'm so grateful for your friendship, for your
Yeah, thank
friendship
you.
of your whole family. And I want to just say to everybody, please go get the audiobook of How to Prepare. I think Buzzy, as you can see, is wise beyond just his knowledge of trivia. He's wise in soul. Continue to light up the world with everything that you have. We are so blessed to have you as a member of the tribe. Stay well, be well. And in memory of Alex Trebek, may his memory be a blessing for all of us. And please let us say amen.
Thank you.
Thank you.